Hello, my name is Samantha Abramson, and I am the Executive Director at the Nathan and Esther Pelt Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, also known as HERC. We are a proud and independent program of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. On behalf of HERC's board and staff, I am honored to welcome you all to tonight's program, The Architects of Auschwitz. This program is generously sponsored by Bradley and Marilyn Shovers and co-presented with the Wisconsin chapter of the American Institute of Architects. We are also beyond grateful to all of the promotional partners in Milwaukee and across the globe. Thank you. We're not going to list everybody by name, but hopefully you got a chance to see this really wonderful alliance of partners on the slides in the beginning of the program. Thank you so much for your support. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Robert Jan van Pelt. Dr. Van Pelt is a professor at the University of Waterloo and is one of the world's leading experts on the history of Auschwitz. In 1966, he served as an expert witness in Deborah Lipstadt's defense in the civil libel suit brought against her by British author and neo-Nazi and Holocaust denier David Irving. Van Pelt has greatly contributed to the field of Holocaust studies through his publications, lectures, and exhibits, and we are honored and delighted that he is with us tonight. I think he's with us all the way from Montreal as part of his travels. As the only organization in Wisconsin with Holocaust education core to its mission, HERC provides educator workshops, speakers bureau engagements, community programs, in-class activities, and digital resources like our innovative platform, teachholocaust.org, which includes over 100 lesson plans ready to use at no cost to educators. With the new Holocaust and genocide mandate in our state, our work has never been more timely or important. We do this work to ensure that future generations learn from this challenging chapter of history and use it as an inspiration to think about its impact on today's world and their own roles in becoming upstanders to bring a more just society for all. All of this vital work is made possible through the generosity of individuals like you, and we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter if you're not already. Before I hand the microphone over to our guest speaker, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my day. Like many of you, it started waking up, getting some caffeine, and getting dressed and getting out the door. I live in an apartment complex, and I took an elevator, a rather industrial elevator, down to the basement level garage where I was able to avoid the rain and get into my car and with my daughter, get on the road. And we drove to her school where I dropped her off in this really wonderful building that's been designed with students in mind and has different wings for the different grade levels and bright colors and a lot of vibrancy. And then I continued on my drive. I got to my office at the Milwaukee Jewish Federation and enjoyed working in that building. And then I went to meet a friend for coffee, and we were at this really lovely cafe that had a very cozy atmosphere. You walk in and there are lots of windows, lots of bright lights, and there's an open kitchen so you can see all the really delicious baked goods being prepared. And it occurred to me that in all of these experiences, my surroundings were carefully crafted by the architects who built the spaces. These are people I'll never know. Without ever knowing them, they had undoubtedly shaped how I lived my day and how I live my day every day. Tonight, we pose a central question. How was architecture used during the Holocaust to commit genocide? And what are the moral and ethical roles of architects in what they choose to design and build? After tonight's talk, I will jump back on and I will moderate a short Q&A. So during Dr. Van Pelt's discussion, please feel free to use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Submit your questions, and we will get through as many of those questions as we can. And with that, I am really honored to introduce Dr. Robert Jan van Pelt.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I just have to admit that I was very precocious as a child, but in 1966, I was only 10 years old. So that was not the year that I served as an expert witness. It actually started in 1999. I think the sixes became nines. And that ended in 2001. I'm very, very pleased and honored to be part of your program tonight. Michael Morris is an old friend of mine. We met in New York a couple of years ago, and I'm very grateful also to him to have suggested I would talk to you tonight. I'm going to share a slide deck. So basically, you will not see much of me until we go to the question and answer session. I am actually in a hotel in Montreal. It's an interesting hotel because it's a Chinese-themed hotel built in the 1960s. Actually, my wife's family, who actually come from Poland originally, used to have dinner here with family members in Montreal. It was the center of the survivor community. And interestingly, about the relationship between Chinese food and the Jewish community, it was, of course, owned by the Jewish mob. So there's a lot of interesting kind of history in this building that directly or indirectly relates to the survivor community here in Montreal, which is one of the largest one in Canada. So let me try to get the slide show running. I have a slide deck here. I think that I should. Do you see all my first slide, the Architects of Auschwitz? So yes, when you build a building, you first need to have a site. And so I'm starting to talk about the site of Auschwitz. So here we have a map from the 16th century of the very first atlas ever produced by Ortelius. And when we look at the right side of the slide, a little right from that circle, which is actually Bohemia, surrounded by mountains, you already see that just at a short distance from the city of Krakow, you see a town called Oswiecim. And that is indeed the town where the Germans in the 1940s will build an extermination camp. But that very town of Oswiecim was also a German town that had been built in the 1270s. And so here my reconstruction of that original town built by German settlers in what had been Polish land, but which had been Germanicized as part of what is known as the German push towards the east. Small town, but still important as a kind of geopolitical reality in the same way that towns were in the American West in the 19th century. So here we have a photo of that town, of the main market square in the around 1910. We see here basically Polish horsemen, and in the back we see a building that is a number of shops, and this building will return in my talk, all owned, by the way, by Jewish shopkeepers. And behind that, the Catholic Church, to our back is the Great Synagogue. So Oswiecim, or Auschwitz, the city had two names since the 16th century, was well known for its as a producer of high-quality liquor in the Austrian Empire. In the early 20th century, it was part of the Austrian Empire. And so here we see then on the bottle produced by Jacob Haberfeld, again, a Jewish firm, we see then the castle of Oswiecim, or Auschwitz, which actually happened to be at that time the home of the Haberfeld family. Most of the inhabitants of this little town were Jews. The surrounding population were Polish. Now, this is the map of Europe before 1914. Green is Russia, pink is Austria-Hungary, yellow is Germany, and more or less where the green, the pink, and the yellow meet at the lower half towards the left. On the border, this thick red line is the town of Auschwitz, or Oswiecim, indicated here by the circle. So very clearly, this is a map of 1914, and it clearly indicates that this town is, first of all, on the border between the pink and the yellow part, that is Germany and Austria-Hungary, close to the Russian border, and it has two names. So here we have another map, and on this railway map from 1914, Auschwitz is indicated with the green circle, and you see it's more or less halfway located between the blue circle, which is Vienna, and the pink circle, which is Lviv, or Lvov, or Lemberg, the capital of Galicia. And the railway that connects Vienna to Lviv went through Auschwitz because it had to basically go around the Tatra Mountains. And Auschwitz was located close to a gap between the Erzgebirge and the Tatra Mountains, the Carpathian Mountains. So because of that, it became a very important railway junction, also because from Auschwitz, you could connect to the German railway system that from Katowice connected to Berlin and Hamburg and Bremen, and that means also to the United States and Canada, and then the railway system that brought via Warsaw passengers to St. Petersburg and Moscow. So an important railway place already since actually the mid-19th century. Now, this is an imagined map of Germany in the 1930s, where red is the area that is inhabited by Germans, ethnic Germans, people who are considered German from the racist Nazi point of view. But these dotted lines towards the east in Russia are basically what the Germans consider to be the cultural boundaries of Germany. And within these cultural boundaries were many other nations like Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, and so on. But if you now look at the location of Auschwitz in the blue circle in this imagined map of the greater Germany, both that is already inhabited by Germans, and Germans are also in these kind of red dots everywhere, and the cultural Germany, you see actually that Auschwitz is right in the center of this area that is claimed by Germany also as basically a kind of future empire. These were in some way the ideals that Hitler had of the area that was going to be part of the greater German Reich. So peripheral in one sense, on the border before 1914, but in the center in the German imagination. So here again, we have the railway map. We have the town Oswiecim. We see these railway connections. And here we see from around 1900 a photo of the station of Oswiecim, an important kind of meeting point of the Russian, German, and Austrian-Hungarian railway systems. You see at the back the name of Oswiecim, and you see there also the railway personnel that was servicing, in this case, an Austrian-Hungarian train. The reason that Auschwitz was actually many Jews who traveled from Galicia, from Austrian Galicia, but also from Russian Poland to the United States, actually went through Auschwitz on their way back to the harbors of Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Bremen, and Hamburg. And here we see one map by a shipping company that basically transports people on the shortest way to America via Rotterdam and Amsterdam, and have located the location of Auschwitz. So trains with immigrants would pass through Auschwitz, and quite often the immigrants had to stay in Auschwitz for some time before they got permission to cross the border into Germany. Their papers were checked, and here we see a cartoon of immigrants on their way to the United States who have been given to via Bremen, who have been given now permission to leave the station of Oswiecim and board the train to the harbor of Bremen and then the ship to the United States. So because there was not much hotel capacity in the town of Oswiecim, quite often Jewish passengers would stay with Jewish families, and this is one of the reasons the Oswiecim Jewish community became quite well known, also was very happily remembered in the New World. During the First World War, the Austrian-Hungarian government decided to create dormitories at the border that would accommodate all of these people who had to wait for permission to enter Germany. Here we have the image of these dormitories, and here we have then the poster of the ships that would leave from Hamburg to New York. So Auschwitz is part, or Oswiecim is part of a big infrastructure of travel by the end of the 19th century. And it has also started to create accommodation for that. What happens after the First World War is that Germany loses significant territories in the East. And so when we're now going to look at this map, and we're going to look in greater detail, and just under the word Oberschlesien and the city Katowice, you find the word Auschwitz with a black dot. The heavy black line is the old border that had existed until really 1918, before the creation of the new independent Polish state. But the pinkish area had been actually surrendered by Germany to the new Polish state. So Germany was now basically moved westwards, and only the really red part was Gleiwitz and Beuthen. That was Germany, so Gleiwitz and Beuthen had become border stations. So Auschwitz was not a border station anymore. And in that sense, it lost most of its business, the business that had been generated by travelers. So the question was what now to do with all of these dormitories that had been created to accommodate up to 4,000 immigrants going to the United States. The Polish army, the new Polish army, thought that they could use these barrack buildings, and they transformed them into a military base. And here we have a picture of their use for a regiment of cavalry around 1936. Or here we have then the cavalryman for a picture again in the mid 1930s, and you see that they're all in the city of Oswiecim. So new business in that town, and it served quite well, these dormitories, as a Polish military base. But then already in the 1930s, Nazis were basically claiming that Poland didn't have any right to exist. They considered Poland to be a state of robbers, a Raubstaat. And here we have a cover of a book that basically talks about the elimination of the territories that Poland had annexed from Germany in 1919, most importantly, the so-called corridor that connected the Polish heartland to the Baltic Sea. So indeed, in 1939, in September, Germany launches attack on Poland, and also then a few weeks later, the Soviet Union, on the basis of a secret agreement between Berlin and Moscow, attacks Poland from the east. And within 1 month, Poland has been defeated. And Germany takes back the territories that it had had before 1918, before the creation of the new Polish state. But then it takes a little bit more. And so you see the new annexed territories that Germany basically incorporates in the German Reich. These are the pink territories. You see an area called Sichenau, West Preußen, Vaterland in the center, and then Oberschlesien at the bottom. And Oberschlesien is the area in which Auschwitz is located. And the border has moved now towards the east of what had been the old border between Austria-Hungary and Germany. And so here we see a map from 1940, and we see now Krakow at the right side of the picture. This is a German road map. We see Katowice, which is and Gleiwitz to the left. Gleiwitz had been the old border post. We see Auschwitz in the center, but the new border between the annexed territories and the occupied territories, Generalgouvernement, is actually this green line. So you see that Auschwitz is now formally annexed in the German Reich, and that has great consequences for its future. So it becomes a German town now officially. This is a road sign that is created in late 1939. It belongs to the Kreis of Bilitz, the district of Bilitz, and a process of Germanization starts in the town of Auschwitz and in the other annexed territories. So here we see a map from 1940. And we see basically German immigrants coming from territories that have been handed to Stalin as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, parts of Romania, eastern of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia or Estland. All of these areas were going to be occupied or annexed by the Soviet Union, but there were large German populations there. And under this special secret annex to this agreement, they were allowed to move to the annexed territories of Germany. That means informally Polish land, including also the area around Auschwitz. So here we have pictures from a picture book that was given to the man in charge of this operation, Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS. We see here the deportation of Polish peasants into what is occupied territory, the occupied Polish territory, the general government. And you see SS soldiers marching these people towards the train station. And then here we see ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe who have arrived there quite often on the same day that the Polish owners are kicked out to take over the farms and, of course, take care of the animals. And you see that the operation is conducted by SS men. These are 2 SS officers. The SS was in charge of this ethnic cleansing operation. And that is important also in relationship to what other things that the SS are going to do in this territory. Because the Polish farms and the Polish villages were considered to be not really up to snuff by the German authorities, this man in the center, Konrad Meyer, an SS officer who was also a professor of geography, started a project to redesign completely the annexed territories, to create an architecture, farms, villages, and even cities that were going to be fit for Germans, for good, racially pure Germans. And here we have a discussion of a model created for a village to be created around 2 kilometers from the now again German town of Auschwitz, with the governor of Upper Silesia, Oberschlesien, Fritz Bracht, basically giving his comments on the design. So here we have a first map of the arrivals of ethnic Germans in the Auschwitz area. So this is a regional map. And you see that there are all these black dots and these little white dots that are south of the pink circle. The pink circle is Auschwitz. And you see that the area to the south and to the east of Auschwitz is quickly being Germanicized. It's a rural area, so it's easy to throw out the rural population and import German peasants. But the area to the left, to the west of it, was an industrial area. And this is a picture, it's a propaganda book of Upper Schlesien returns home, so it's now becoming German again. But the problem with ethnic cleansing in an industrial area is that it's much more difficult to replace skilled industrial workers, even if they're Polish, if the population pool from which you have to draw the replacements are peasants, German peasants. So the Germans, the SS, was unable to apply its policy of quick ethnic cleansing by moving the peasants out and moving German peasants in. And so they sent a relatively high-ranking SS officer who had experience running a concentration camp, Rudolf Höss, from Berlin to Poland to basically find a place to create a concentration camp that will basically create terror in the region to keep the Polish population that cannot be expelled because the Germans need their industrial skills in place. So this is so he basically goes to Poland. He talks to the German army. The German army, which has taken over as according to the laws of war, Polish army bases. And one of the bases that now the German army is controlling is the bases just outside of the town of Oswiecim, or Auschwitz as it's now called, which had been built in 1916 as dormitories for the emigrants going to the United States. So this is the original blueprint that basically Höss encounters. He looks at it and he says, okay, I can make a concentration camp out of this collection of buildings. And so basically Berlin approves this. And so this is the well-known Auschwitz I, basically the main street of this originally transit station for emigrants. And he says, okay, we can work with these buildings, housing up to a year before Polish soldiers to make a concentration camp out of that. So what do you need for a concentration camp? Of course, the first thing you need to have a fence. So architects begin work. He basically imports an otherwise unknown architect from Berlin who works in the architecture design office. And one of the first projects that's being designed are basically poles for a barbed wire fence. They decide to have concrete poles. So they're all drawn with the usual precision of a sophisticated architectural design. Then also we get a second plan of basically the location of these barracks. And you see now at the bottom left, you see that not all barracks are going to be surrounded, but you see that only a part of the collection of these barracks are going to be surrounded. You see a barbed wire fence indicated. Inside the barbed wire fence, it's at Schutzhaftlager. This means protective custody camp. That is the prisoner compound. And then above it, you see the label concentration camp, Konzentrationslager. And so this now basically is the document that shows the first document that shows the transformation of that area into a closed prisoner community. So here we have then, when you go and visit Auschwitz, the main camp, here we see one of these rather ominous looking corner posts. There's a double kind of fence around this camp is created. They absolutely do not want to have any risk of breakouts because it's still a hostile area for the Germans, unlike Dachau or Sachsenhausen or Flossenburg or Buchenwald, which was in Germany itself. And even when you escaped from that camp, you could not really expect much support. Here, the Polish population that could not be moved was expected to give support to escaping Polish prisoners. Here we're looking at the inside of the barbed wire fence that was created in the early spring of 1940, and you see then the zone of death, the gravel area. Any prisoner, the prisoner compound is to the left. Any prisoner who would basically cross the wire, kind of a trip wire with the little post into that gravel area, could be immediately shot without any guard needing to ask permission for that. And then, of course, there needs to be a gate. So this was also part of the project. You create a fence with a gate, and then the infamous gate Arbeit macht frei was created, a relatively simple gate with the motto of work makes free, that already had become part of the first concentration camp run by the SS, Dachau, in 1933. A motto that people always interpret as being particularly cynical. But in 1933, when mostly German communists and social democrats were incarcerated in the concentration camp, at that time there was really a philosophy in the SS that a short kind of cure of healthy work, of hard work, would basically heal these people from any communist sympathies. And in general, most people in 1933 who were arrested and put in concentration camps quickly were released after their formal conversion to Nazism. So in this case, the prisoners are typically not Germans, they are Poles, and typically also once you arrive as a Pole in a concentration camp like Auschwitz, that means that you're going to stay there. Very few Poles were ever released. So the Arbeit macht frei, the work set free, became for Polish prisoners a particular kind of a cynical admonition. Conditions in this concentration camp, in these old dormitories for the emigrants and the Polish army, were very bad. Basically, there was hardly any furniture. There was no money for it. There was no material. So in the first year, basically, people had to sleep on the floor. There were no tables. There were no chairs. There was not anything. And the mainly Polish prisoners there, mostly Catholic Polish prisoners, also smaller groups of Jewish prisoners at that time, they basically lived on the floor without very little tools to take care of themselves. So conditions in the camp were extremely rough. Here we have drawings by a former prisoner who, after his liberation, basically recorded life in the camp in a series of 70 to 80 drawings. Already at this time, because the camp was meant to project terror into the surrounding area, the SS created a torture room inside the camp. And so here we have a picture of it, but the Komsky who created these drawings never was in this room. So that's a kind of a little bit of a fancy reconstruction. Basically, torture, of course, was created in order to project terror. It didn't have anything with interrogations about some useful knowledge for the camp Gestapo. Also, a prison was created within the concentration camp itself. So the basement of one of the barracks, Block 11, as it was called, was transformed. This is we have one drawing of it, but it's difficult to read. So this is my reconstruction. You see the normal cells, you see to the left, but then you see also 3 standing cells. These standing cells are around 2 feet by 2 feet, and they are around 7 feet high. And up to 4 people would be locked in mostly for the night only, and then the next day they had to work, but sometimes until they died. So real instruments of torture and use, as you see, there is no supply of fresh air in these standing cells. Again, standing cells designed by architects. And then right next to it, in the courtyard, between two of these barracks, these blocks, an execution yard. No drawings for the design of this execution yard survive, but somebody obviously made the design for this kind of wooden wall designed to absorb bullets. So mortality was very high in the camp, both mortality as a result of disease, but also mortality as a result of executions. So already in the summer of 1940, within a few months after the creation of the camp, the camp commandant Hus decides to order a crematorium. The crematorium that's going to be created in an existing ammunition depot that is partly covered by dirt to basically ensure its safety, because you want to protect the ammunition from, in case of war, of shells coming in. And so you see here basically the old ammunition depot. In the plan to the left, you see 3 double ovens, so 6 ovens really, and the big chimney that's connected to this ammunition, the former ammunition depot, by an underground kind of flue. We'll come back to this building in a moment. Now, the firm that gets the commission to build the ovens is a firm from central Germany, Topf from Erfurt. And one of the reasons that they are a market leader in crematorium design is because they know how to create ovens that don't produce any smoke, rauchlos. And so this is then one of the reasons that also the SS like to work with them. So here we have a reconstruction of the work in this crematorium. You see a Leichenhalle, you see a left, you see 2 of the ovens that have just been filled with corpses. So in the meantime, peasants continue to arrive in the Auschwitz. So this is an idealized version of how such a peasant would have looked like. And so in order to help the peasants to get that the Auschwitz concentration camp, which is located in a little blue dot, will appropriate a 15 square mile area around the camp to create experimental farms, to see if the camp can help to basically increase agricultural production in the area. So it's a scientific project. So the area surrounded by the red line is this new, large kind of model farm that is going to be prepared by the inmates. They're going to work in the land, but they're also going then to provide, basically they're going to try out different crops in the area which hadn't been grown before. So large infrastructural works are now going to be carried out on the backs of the inmates, like creating drainage channels and so on, to basically prepare this area for agricultural production. Here we have one of those, the so-called Königsgraben. After it's finished, again, all done without any mechanized diggers or so on. It's all inmate labor, and again, many inmates died doing this. Here we see stables being created, or this is a pigsty actually. You see an SS man talking to an inmate who's been part of the construction. Big barns are being created. So basically, by the end of 1940, when in Berlin, people in the SS headquarters talk about Auschwitz, they primarily think about an experimental farm. Also, we got a great interest at this time in experimenting with growing dandelions, because dandelions actually are one of the raw materials for rubber. In Russia in the 1930s, experiments had been done. Germany had been cut off of the supply of natural rubber, but the dandelions have a kind of rubbery kind of sap. And so the idea was that one of the major crops in this area were going to be dandelions as part of a project of creating homemade, German-made rubber. This then are the great greenhouses that are erected in significant parts of this area to basically experiment with dandelion production. Again, all worked by inmates, designed by architects. And here we still have some of these greenhouses existing today. Very few people who are visiting Auschwitz today will ever see these greenhouses and know that they were part of this large project to basically create a native German rubber production. However, the greatest bet that the German Reich creates in creating artificial rubber is in a chemical process that had been invented by the IG Farben company. Here we see their headquarters in Frankfurt, the largest company in Europe and the second largest company in 1939 in the world, with only Standard Oil of New Jersey or Esso being larger in capitalization. IG Farben is a very wealthy company. It is capitalism at its best or at worst, depending on where you stand in your appreciation of capitalism. We have here a share, and IG Farben, the IG Farben management, gets interested to expand or to basically create large rubber factories, synthetic rubber factories in the east of Germany. So. By the way, of course, IG Farben is basically, it combines under kind of one umbrella the whole German chemical industry. So if you, for example, get your Bayer aspirin, or if you're wearing some nylon clothing, it's very likely that the nylon originally went back to an IG Farben patent, and certainly the Bayer company was also part of this conglomerate. So the IG Farben company has created a process to create artificial rubber, or gummi. So there are two ways to do it, either out of natural rubber that comes from Indonesia or maybe from Brazil originally, but of course in wartime that is not available, or to create it out of coal and lime and water. And that is the process to the right. It's called Buna. And this is a process for which the town of Auschwitz was a kind of ideal location. Here we have a planning map from 1940, published in the German Economical Journal. It talks about the future development of the Auschwitz region, and it basically discusses also about ideal locations for a new synthetic rubber factory. Two places were under consideration, the one in the blue dot, Heidelberg, and the one in the pink dot, Auschwitz. And the reason that both of these towns were found, because the center between them, where we see all the gray area, that was a coal mining area, but because it was a watershed, there was little water in this area. But Auschwitz was located on a river, that was the old border river, the Vistula, and also Heidelberg was located on a river, that was the Oder. And so in Auschwitz, coal and water came together as the two major raw materials of synthetic rubber, and just east of Auschwitz there were large areas with lime, and so basically the raw materials didn't need much transport, and in the end finger on the scale. One of the major issues that went against Auschwitz as a destiny for IG Farben was the fact that IG Farben was dedicated, was committed to good housing for its employees. And this comes as a picture from an IG Farben company journal from 1940. But Auschwitz was really a small Polish town. It didn't have any good housing. And so here we see a planning map from 1941. You see that in green, the big synthetic rubber plant as it ultimately built. We see in yellow the little Polish town of Auschwitz. We see in pink the concentration camp, but then we see all these these gray dots around it. This is a plan for the urbanization of the town of Auschwitz according to the German domestic urban and also house design. And so Himmler had to convince the IG Farben management that yes, the IG Farben people could live a dignified Aryan Nordic life in Auschwitz. So you hired architects, you start planning, and so here we have an urban planning map of Auschwitz from 1942, where we see the expansion from the yellow original center with 3 major new large kind of suburbs. You see the concentration camp in pink, not indicated in detail in green to the right. You see the beginning of the plant. So in early 1941, mid-1941, when in Berlin people were thinking about Auschwitz, not necessarily anymore about peasants, but now they were thinking about the city Auschwitz, the new model city Auschwitz that was going to house the workers of one of the largest synthetic rubber factories in Europe. 65,000 people are going to live in this town. So now houses are being rebuilt. So we have a facelift here for those shops, originally Jewish inhabited. It's going to be now a more dignified kind of German community hall that you see to the bottom, again, designed by German architects, and it still exists in its German shape today. Today, it is a courthouse. So there are these remnants in Auschwitz today of that building project of the 1940s. The Germans are quite ambitious. Here we see a design for the National Socialist Party headquarters in the new town of Auschwitz. A design that is going to measure up to the new dignity of Auschwitz as a district capital. So indeed, it has become quite an important town in the whole neighborhood. And again, when architects sing in 1941 about Auschwitz, they think about a large kind of urban renewal project. Here we have the new station of Auschwitz, again, a massive station. And you see the 6 railway tracks to the back with platforms, covered platforms, and so on. Quite a sophisticated station, everything by now in the planning stage. And indeed, pieces of that German extension of Auschwitz were executed. So again, if you go in the town of Auschwitz and you come in this street, we have Polish 4-story housing to the right, but we have German 2.5-story housing to the left, completed in 1943 for the kind of rank and file of the IG Farben employees. So when we talk about Auschwitz, the Auschwitz as ultimately it develops in late 1941, we have a city that's being developed, we have a plant that's being built, and then we have a concentration camp. But in some way, the concentration camp is still kind of the least important part of this whole constellation. The construction of the factory, however, is a massive undertaking. And because a lot of money is coming into this project, Hus, the commandant of Auschwitz, decides that he will basically rent in exchange for cash that is flowing into the camp. And it is this deal of the devil, in this case, the devil being the SS that IG Farben makes, that ultimately creates this enormous plant that still exists. And nowadays, it's actually, you can visit it. It used to be closed until the plant went bankrupt around 15 years ago. But here we have images from this plant. This construction brings an enormous amount of money into the coffers of the SS. And this then allows them to start to plan for the extension of the concentration camp. So we have here in the blue area, the original dormitories that became Polish military barracks. And in this plan of the Stammlager, the main camp of early 42, you see this enormous extension that basically runs on this diagonal. And indeed, now planned for 30,000 inmates, this was going to be the largest concentration camp in the whole concentration camp system, all made possible by the cash infusion that was generated by the work for IG Farben. So then also, as part of this whole project to build a new city, the SS decides to build inside the area that had been taken over, the 15 square miles, in order to create a experimental farm, a second large camp next to the village of Birkenau. This is the pink area. And this camp is going to house originally 100,000, and then after a modification in the conditions of its construction, 125,000 Soviet prisoners of war who are going to be employed in the construction of the town. A labor force that is going to be assembled there, labor force that's made available as a result of the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, which led to an enormous number of prisoners of war being taken who were not given the protection under the Geneva Convention by the German army because they were considered to be subhuman or Untermenschen. And here we have a publication that shows, in this case to the right, these prisoners of war who are compared with the Huns in the Middle Ages. And they basically said, these, again, the Huns are here. These people are not humans. Their faces are caricatures of the human face. They are a fist blow in the face of all that is human. In other words, people who do not deserve protection. And so as these Soviet soldiers are surrendering to the Germans, they're not going to be put in proper prisoner of war camp, which basically guarantees lodgings that are the same as for the soldiers of the army that has captured them. But Hus, who now basically gets control over these POWs because he is now basically the slave keeper for the building of the city of Auschwitz, he orders the construction of a new camp. But before he does that, he also orders the construction of a gas chamber in Auschwitz because many of the soldiers are suspected to be Soviet commissars, and they need to be executed upon arrival so that they don't create trouble amongst the prisoners. And so they use for this gas a delousing agent based on cyanide, already used in the camp for regular delousing purposes of clothing, mattresses, and so on, called Zyklon B or Cyclone. And this is already available in the camp. There are already cyclone delousing chambers. We have a design for that. It's all perfectly innocent as long as you only kill lice and not human beings. But then Hus decides that in the basement of Block 11, in this camp prison in the basement, he is now going to experiment in this corridor with applying this cyanide gas to a group of 500 Soviet POWs who are used here as guinea pigs to see if indeed they will die quickly and how they will die. And so Hus is on this side of the bars. He's observing this as basically cyanide, a tin of cyanide is opened. Hus and his adjutant are wearing gas masks, and on the other side are the Soviet POWs who suffocate within 10 minutes. This is how the murder by Zyklon B enters Auschwitz. It is introduced there to murder Soviet POWs. Quickly, a gas chamber is created in the crematorium. The old morgue is now transformed into a gas chamber because in the basement of this building in the camp, it is quote unquote too awkward to have all of these murders, too difficult so to get the corpses out of the building, up the stairs and then towards the crematorium, easier to kill the people right next to the ovens. So the light blue space by the end of 1941 is now a cyclone gas chamber. And this is the gas chamber as it exists today. It has been preserved in the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. But then, after some experimental gassings of Soviet POWs, suddenly there seems to be a change in the victims that are arriving in Auschwitz. Jews from the Upper Silesia area who had been imprisoned in the ghetto of Sosnowice, many of whom had actually come from the town of Auschwitz, start arriving to be murdered in that gas chamber. So so the next thing is then that construction of that big camp for all the Soviet POWs. This is the architect, Fritz Ertl, a very young architect. He's a graduate of the Bauhaus, which actually happened to be the best architecture school in Europe at the time. So much for architectural education and the quality of it. He designs in the center of this large agricultural area, a camp that very much reflects Bauhaus principle of order and of rationality. It has the main camp to the right, a kind of symmetrical arrangement with the SS camp at the bottom. Then it has a quarantine camp to the left, and they are separated by what's called a neutral zone. A neutral zone that is the area that has to prevent diseases to jump from the quarantine camp into the main camp too easily. What happens, however, is that in a second plan, the quarantine zone, the pink area, is occupied by a railway line. And we have here a drawing for the gate that is being created for Auschwitz, Birkenau. And you see then also to the right on the top elevation, that is the exterior elevation, you see basically the guardhouse, and under it is the large gate through which trains can enter into the neutral zone and basically drop off prisoners that are arriving. This becomes the infamous gate of death, and this is the oldest blueprint that we have. So a very important document, I would say, in the history of the Holocaust. Brick barracks are being created for Birkenau, again designed by Ertel and also modified by his boss Bischoff. What makes these barracks very interesting is again that they basically cramp around originally 550 people, inmates, into this space, but then very, very densely packed, 3 people per shelf, 9 people per bay. But then what happens is that the Hus gets the job to increase the capacity of Birkenau from 100,000 to 125,000 inmates. And the architects do this very simply by now calculating what the capacity of each barrack is when you put 4 persons on each shelf. You see the little calculation to the left, and the capacity is increased from 550 to 748 men. It is literally a calculation that must have taken the architect 5 minutes, and now the barrack is even more crowded, and objectively it is a war crime because the inhabitants of this barrack were going to be Soviet POWs who are in some way protected by the laws of war. So when you go today to Auschwitz-Birkenau, you look at these brick barracks, these were part and parcel of the POW camp designed to house now 125 Soviet prisoners of war. Large kitchens are being designed, again, blueprints to survive of all of these projects. And here you see one of those kitchens. All the chimneys, quite often people arriving in Auschwitz as visitors think that these are the crematorium chimneys. They're not. They're actually the chimneys to which are connected the large cooking vessels that were used to prepare the very, very, by the way, small meals that the Soviet POWs would get. They were living on starvation diets. The large latrines here. Again, 400 people could defecate at the same time. Now try to do this in a way that keeps things clean. Find your place. You only have 5 minutes to basically do what you need to do, and a total chaos is the result of this architectural design. Very quickly, the SS realizes that there's not enough bricks to build the brick barracks, and so then they get off-the-shelf wooden barracks designed for horses. So the famous or infamous horse stable barracks that then fill the rest of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And here we have the interior. Up to 1,000 people were housed in each of these barracks. Quite a good design for horses. It doesn't work for human beings. So, in the meantime, the camp in Auschwitz, because so many Soviet POWs are coming, needs more incineration capacity. So the blue area is the camp, the original camp, dating back to 1916. But right next to it, to the right, you see the yellow building. That is the old crematorium that had been in use since 1940, and a blue building that is a new crematorium that's being designed in 1941, in the fall of 41. This is the Topf engineer who basically develops a new kind of oven, which is much more efficient. in which many corpses are going to be burned at the same time, in which uses a minimal amount of fuel. In fact, it uses the energy that's in the bodies itself to continue to work. So it's almost like a perpetuum mobile. His name is Kurt Prüfer. A model of ovens, of which today one example survives in the Buchenwald concentration camp. We call these 3 muffle ovens, 3 openings, and each muffle would be able to burn 4 corpses per hour. So this oven would have been able 4 corpses per hour, around 100 corpses per 24 hours, which means that this single oven would have had a capacity of almost 300 corpses per day. Now think about the mortality if you start looking at numbers. The new crematorium in Auschwitz is going to have 5 of these ovens, which means an incineration capacity of around 1,500 corpses a day, designed in this case by architect Walter de Jaco, who had gotten his education in Austria, in Innsbruck. So here we have then this very big building in the yellow area. We see then these 5 triple muffle ovens. We see in blue, we see a corpse elevator that connects it to the basement level. And we see in pink an entry with a slide that connects basically from the main floor to the basement, a corpse slide, which was a typical detail of SS crematoria. And then in the basement, you see then these very large morgues. Actually, they extend beyond basically to what is drawn, the yellow areas, very, very large morgues, indicating a very expectation of great mortality, especially probably during times of epidemics. And this building had an incineration capacity of 1,500 corpses per day. So we have the original blueprints here. Incredible. I mean, no civilian crematorium had ever come close to that. The largest civilian crematoria in the 1940s, the type had developed since the 1870s, had probably 10 corpses per day. So we are here in basically 2 orders of magnitude away from what had been the largest such building type at the time itself. But you see, these are beautiful drawings. These are very well drawn drawings. These are very skilled architects who designed both the building and skilled engineers who designed these ovens. And so part of this building are these very large morgues, and it are these morgues. They're still indicated as morgues. Will ultimately be transformed into gas chambers. Here we see a model of this crematorium, and basically we see one of those morgues after its conversion into a gas chamber. We see going diagonally from left to right. So here the ovens, the triple muffle ovens, you see they're kind of a nasty looking kind of interior in this space. And so what we are now going to do is actually look how this building, from a building that was designed to incinerate the corpses of people who had died outside of the building, was going to be transformed in a factory of murder, in which the ovens were going to incinerate the corpses of people who were murdered inside the building, in these basement rooms. And so again, some detail here, and most importantly, the corpse elevator, which becomes quite important in the operation of this building. And you see to the bottom that basement that becomes actually a gas chamber. And already you see the detail, the architectural element that allows this transformation to happen, a so-called gas column. By the way, Prüfer got, for his work on the development of the 3 muffle oven, after he asked for a Christmas bonus in 1941. This is the letter in which he asks for the bonus, because he developed it in his own free time, and he gets a 150 mark Christmas bonus for the work he has done. And these are then, of course, the ovens that make Auschwitz in the most lethal of death factories ever, 150 marks, around $50 today. $50 then, probably $500 today, sorry. So here we have that building in blue, originally designed next to the main camp of Auschwitz. But then in the next drawing, it has disappeared in the drawing. You can't see it anymore. I've indicated here where that building used to be, but it's not indicated anymore. in the blue. So the question is, where did this building go? And we have another drawing of the camp at Birkenau, now expanded with the quarantine area to the left, and then the main street in the center, and the railway station, you see it again on the left side. But on the right, you see now that same building, the plan of that same building has popped up in the northwest corner of the camp. So that's remarkable. Why does this very complex, sophisticated building, why is it now going to be built in Birkenau? The answer has to do with a decision on the 6th of January by Reichsmarshal Heinrich Göring, who's in charge of the economy, inclusive all construction. So many Soviet POWs have died as a result of the bad conditions in the POW camps that there is now a real labor shortage in the German armament industry. And because there is in general a building stop already in Germany, Göring decides and announces that Soviet POWs cannot be used anymore for construction of buildings. So suddenly, Höss, who has only received 15,000 Soviet POW by that time, and is expecting another 110,000 Soviet POWs, doesn't have a workforce anymore, but he's under obligation with IG Farben to produce a workforce to help build the town of Auschwitz. This happens just to be at the time of the Wannsee Conference, where Himmler gets control over all Jews in Europe. He formally now is basically put in charge of what we now call the Holocaust. And so once Himmler has control of all of the Jews in Europe, he basically sends, and then here we have what had happened until then, ghettoization of Polish Jews before the Holocaust has become a continent-wide phenomenon, execution of Ukrainian Jews in this case, just before their execution in what is called the Holocaust by bullets in the summer and fall of 1941. But at that time, the Holocaust was not yet a continent-wide phenomenon. That only happens in January 1942 as a result of the Wannsee Conference. And one of the things that had happened is that the Central European Jews had been kept alive because Hitler thought that they would be useful as hostages to ensure American good behavior. That means America not joining the war on the British side. But after Pearl Harbor, that hope was lost. And so the Jews of Central Europe and Western Europe had lost their value as hostages to ensure American neutrality. So now the full propaganda against the United States begins. The Jew, the great conspirer, which in some way coordinates the actions between England, United States, and the Soviet Union, behind the enemy powers, the Jew. And we now get the first extermination camp in Kelmno is being created. It is at this moment that in some way the fate of Polish Jewry is sealed, but also de facto of West European Jewry. Here we have the arrangement of the camp in Kelmno with a loading point for gas fans in the blue spot, the village or the castle of Kelmno, and then the gas fans basically drive to a forest to the green spot, and by the time the gas fans have arrived, all the people who are in the hold will have been poisoned. This is the first system that is used, but Höss decides that he also needs Jews. He doesn't want to kill them. He wants to use them as slave labor to basically serve the needs of IG Farben. So where do you get Jews? Where do you get 110,000 Jews that you need to build the city, the new city of Auschwitz? So Slovakia in this map is just to the south of Oswiecim, of Auschwitz, as it is today. Independent state then, as it is today. And Slovakia has a Jewish problem. It has a government. You see here the Prime Minister, Tuka, and the President, Tiso, in Bratislava at the presidential palace. And Slovakia had promised to Germany Slovak workers to work in the armament industry, non-Jewish Slovak workers. But they had basically needed those people themselves. They couldn't afford to send them to Germany. So when Germany is pressing and pressing for the Slovak government to send non-Jewish workers, At a certain moment, the prime minister says, what about Jews? We have Jews here in battalions and labor battalions, and Jews are still living in our cities. Will you be willing to take Jewish workers? Berlin initially says not. We don't want Jews to come into our country. We try to get rid of them. But then in the 27th of February, 1942, the SS sends the chief architect in from Berlin to Auschwitz. And there's a meeting in the architecture office. His name is Hans Kammler. And Hans Kammler now goes to Birkenau. They first have the meeting in the architecture office. He goes to Birkenau and he visits this spot at the edge of what is going to be Birkenau. And then he returns to Berlin. And the next thing that happens at that very spot, a peasant cottage is transformed into a gas chamber. Why? Because Tuka, the prime minister of Slovakia, basically had reached an agreement with Germany in which the Slovak government was going to pay 500 marks for every Jew they could send to Germany. There was going to be income for Germany. And the SS said, okay, we're going to use the Jews who can work in Auschwitz as slave labor, but those who cannot work, they will be murdered. Originally, basically, the Germans said, we don't want the young and the old and the sick. You keep them, Mr. Tuka, in Slovakia. But Tuka said, if they stay here, who's going to take care of them? So this was part of the deal. Tuka, the Slovaks get rid of all of their Jews, and the Germans now have in Auschwitz a murder installation in Birkenau, because Birkenau is going to be the place where the new Jewish slave labor force assembled to reconstruct the city of Auschwitz is going to be there. So any person who does not survive the selection, who is not capable of building, is going to be killed in this gas chamber. So the first gas chamber is built, and it doesn't take very long before the second. So this is exactly the location where that gas chamber is. So when then the crematorium is being planned, it's actually being planned right next to that first gas chamber constructed to murder Jews. The Jews who cannot work, cannot do heavy labor of construction. This is how the Holocaust enters Auschwitz. But then you can as well start adapting the building itself, the crematorium, to basically include a gas chamber inside that building. And so what happens in the months that follows is that, first of all, the crematorium is going to be placed now closer to the railway line. It's going to move. And also a second peasant hut is being transformed into gas chambers, as we see it here, reconstruction by one of my students. And this is then the so-called Little White House, or bunker number 2. And this is a drawing by Holocaust survivor David Oler, who worked as a Sonderkommando of this bunker, this gas chamber. And these are the remains in the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum on the grounds of Birkenau. But Himmler comes to Auschwitz and basically says, we're going to do this professionally. The summer of 1942. It's exactly at the time that the construction of the town of Auschwitz has come to a halt because of the worsening war situation. And Himmler, we see here on the right side. And basically, he orders that now the crematoria will be transformed also into murder factories. So morgue number 1, which is in front of us, is going to be equipped with so-called gas columns, installations that allow for the introduction of gas, which comes in as a kind of crystals in a central column where they cannot be interfered with the people in the gas chamber, and with a cage around it. But after 15 minutes, when everyone is dead, those crystals can be hoisted out of the central column, because the commercial product of Zyklon guaranteed the degassing for 24 hours. But you want to be able to enter the gas chamber much earlier in order to be able to start cleaning up. So you do not want to wait for 24 hours before the degassing of the Zyklon has ended. So we see here then the construction of that crematorium by early January 1943, the state of progress, and you see that gas chamber sticking out right next to the chimney of the train, and you see actually the top of these gas columns sticking out. The ovens get completed, so now we have a building that has an incineration capacity of 1,500 corpses per day, and also a destruction capacity of 1,500 corpses per day. Here we have another crematorium being developed at the same time. This is a model that is designed in the summer 42. It has a smaller incineration capacity of only, quote unquote, 750 corpses per day. So these are smaller gas chambers. But by the summer of 1943, basically Auschwitz-Birkenau has an incineration capacity of 4,500 corpses per day. And that is largely to take care of the corpses who are murdered the very same day that they arrive. Now, I want to end here with this statistic. We basically have here a statistic of the Holocaust. We have the total murders per month. So you see that the total murders per month happens between July and 1942 and January 1943. This is the time of Sobibor, Belzec, Treblinka, basically taking the bulk of the murders. It's the most lethal period in the history of the Holocaust. However, the Auschwitz crematoria only come in service in the summer of 1943, because it takes a long time to build sophisticated buildings like that. So in some way, this is the paradox. You see that the total murder rate in the Holocaust has actually dropped in July. At the beginning of July, it's around 10,000 victims. In September 43, it's 50,000. But Auschwitz has actually an incineration capacity of 4,500 times 30, which is of around 130,000 people. So it means that in some way there's an enormous overcapacity in Auschwitz of sophisticated murder and incineration equipment, which actually is not very useful anymore because most Jews have already been murdered. This is in some way, it's the kind of paradox in the story of the Auschwitz crematoria. A lot of equipment, a lot of technology, but in some way it comes too late for the Germans' purpose. Only in the summer of 1944, when we see that other kind of blip to 200,000 people murdered in June 1944, do these crematoria really come into their own as murder factories during the so-called Hungarian action, the deportation and murder of the Hungarian Jews in Auschwitz. So this is where I would like to leave it. And I think I've been a little bit over time, but I certainly welcome your patience with this talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. And we have a lot of questions, and we're going to get to as many as we can. The first questions I'm seeing are about the architects themselves. So I'm seeing a question of how these architects were recruited. How did they get this work?
It's good work. I mean, in 1941, I mean, especially this is the crucial year. The SS basically has a relatively underdeveloped architectural service until 1941. It's Hans Kammler, the man who traveled to Auschwitz in February 1942, who really organizes the SS architectural services on a professional basis. Before that, the SS typically would go to a local architect. They didn't have an in-house office that could do everything. Hans Kammler, who used to be a Luftwaffe general, an Air Force general, basically organizes the whole infrastructure of the SS, both centrally in Berlin and then in various camps where there are branch offices. Now, in 1941, if you're an architect and the war in Russia has just started, they need a lot of people in pioneer battalions for the Waffen-SS or in the army. If you do not want to go to fight in Russia, it's a very cushy job to serve in a concentration camp. So it's a popular job. And for example, Fritz Ertl ultimately does leave Auschwitz, volunteers to leave Auschwitz when he starts to realize actually what Auschwitz has become, and makes various efforts to leave the camp and ends up then in a pioneer battalion fighting in Russia. But certainly, if you look at what were the options for, let's say, German males in a fighting age in 1941, 42, 43, better be in a design office in Auschwitz than be on the Eastern Front.
And they wouldn't have always known, it sounds like, what those
Well, they knew. I
projects
mean, of
were.
course, concentration camps are very violent places, but they're
Mhm.
professionals. You know, professionals don't get too worried about these things.
Mhm.
I mean, there is no architecture, unlike the medical profession. Of course, it didn't make much difference for many doctors, doesn't have an Hippocratic oath or anything that resembles it. When I started teaching architecture in 1985, there was never a course on ethics in architecture. The only kind of ethics is professional ethics, don't overbill your client. Yeah, so it is very interesting that while certain professions do have a clear kind of code, that architects never really developed it. And architects always, in some way assumed they were on the right side of history. They were making the world more beautiful. They were creating a better world. There's always this utopianism in architecture, except that in the case of Auschwitz, the town, we have a utopianism which is very destructive for anyone who isn't racially German.
And as a follow-up, what happens to these architects after the war? Are any of them
Nothing.
prosecuted?
No, so the chief architect of Auschwitz, architects are invisible in general. When you have a doctor doing the selection on the rampe, then of course survivors remember the doctor, Dr. Mengele and so on. They become public figures in the imagination of survivors, of people who are interested in the Holocaust. Until I asked in 1984 for the first time, who designed those buildings, nobody had ever asked the question. And it is, I think, your talk about it, you started today, you gave the thing about who are these architects who designed my home and my
Right.
and the school and so on, that people don't know.
Yeah.
Architects tend to become invisible unless they're star-architects, and star-architects is a modern invention. So it's also, you do not have a person. 99% of the people actually never meets an architect. You meet your doctor when you're ill. So a doctor is a factor in your life. So when a doctor commits a crime, you trust your doctor, and then at a certain moment you have doctors who commit horrendous crimes. That is your imagination, because you have an imagination of what doctors ought to do. But with architects, nobody ever asks. It's an invisible profession. And so they remained invisible until finally in 1970, both Artel and de Jaco, who were Austrian citizens, were accused of participating in a war crime in a trial in Vienna, and they were both acquitted. Because a document, a blueprint, was not considered to be the equivalent of a smoking gun.
Yeah. And that's the related question here is, you showed us these illustrations that prisoners in these camps created. How did that survive? Like, how do we have this evidence from these
all the ones
camps?
that I showed by Komsky were made after the war.
After the war.
Yeah. There are very few drawings that preserve from during the war. And that talk was already becoming too long, but I had some examples of that. But basically, these are reconstructions after the war. But Komsky is a very good, reliable eyewitness, has a good memory. That's why I use them. Also because they do not overly dramatize the situation. Quite often survivors or even artists who weren't survivors who start drawing scenes from the life of Auschwitz, they use an expressionistic language from the 1920s that's overly dramatic. Yeah, they really try to make the point, these people are suffering, with a big capital S. And I like Komsky because it's kind of very objective. So in some way, they're more shocking like that because of the objectivity with which he draws what he has seen and what he remembers.
Thank you. We have a question. Why did Treblinka not adopt this technology?
See, you need in order to build crematoria, you need building permit, you need materials, and you need money. They're very expensive buildings. The big difference between Auschwitz and the Operation Reinhardt camps, that Auschwitz was filled with cash. There was an enormous amount of money coming in, thanks to IG Farben. While Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor were built without a budget. I mean, you have to realize the Holocaust was a project that had no budget. Yeah, they were basically built and maintained on the basis of the loot of Jews arriving. So when you don't have building materials, when you do not have any other money. You don't have, you don't even, there is no ability to build anything sophisticated. That's why those Operation Reinhardt camps were primitive in a sense, but very primitive killing installations can be very efficient. In fact, they're more efficient as long as you do not care, if it's going to be a clean operation. That is, if the only product in the end is smoke and ash. And that was certainly not the case in Treblinka, Belzec, or Sobibor.
Yeah. And related to IG Farben, did the employees there have any contact with the Auschwitz prisoners? How much did they know?
Yes. And so if you, for example, the factory was finished during the war, but it never went into operation. Read Primo Levi about that, because Primo Levi was actually working in a lab as an inmate, Auschwitz inmate, as a slave worker. And he talks, for example, in his The Drowned and the Saved, and also in his the periodic table, he talks actually about the strange relationship with civilian workers in the labs. So, how they, in some way, yes, they helped a little bit, but also, the prisoners were invisible to them, as homeless people are for now, in a sense. Yeah.
And, we know the Nazis were really good at covering up what they wanted covered up. So, aside from these, Kaminsky's post-war reconstructions, what other evidence was available to prove that this existed?
Now we have aerial photos made by the Allies in 1944, as they were preparing for the bombing of the IG Farben plant. We have eyewitness evidence, both of victims, but also, for example, of Hus and Germans who worked there, who gave quite precise, they didn't lie necessarily all the time, testimony, very valuable testimony. And then, of course, in the case of Auschwitz, this is unique, we have the whole architectural archive. The reason that the architectural archive exists is because construction in the camp ceased in the fall of 1944, because the front moved too closely. So basically the architects left the office. They all were basically going to be fighting in pioneer battalions. That means blowing up bridges to basically slow the advance of the Soviets. So when the SS started abandoning camp on the 17th of January, 18th of January 1945 was the beginning of the Death March, they simply had forgotten that there was an architecture office down the road with the basement full of drawings. And that is the reason that this archive survives. And that didn't happen in any other camp. So Auschwitz is unique, not only because it's the largest murder factory, but also because it's the only camp of which we have a full architectural archive.
Wow.
But of course, generally Holocaust historians, this is not a kind of language that they know. So where people had been working on the history of Auschwitz, the problem was there was all of this evidence, which in some ways in a coded language. And so this is where, the few of us who've looked at these drawings, strangely also enough Holocaust deniers who try to use the drawings to argue that these were not gas chambers and so on, that in some way we have this kind of privileged access to this particular kind of evidence, which became very important in the Lipstadt-Irving trial.
Yeah. And as far as the architects building these camps, where were their offices? Where did they do their work?
In the camp, there was an architecture office right next to the camp. They had quite very comfortable quarters. They took care of themselves. We also have the designs for that. There's a big drawing offices for inmate draftsmen and drawing offices for the German draftsmen. There were three kinds of workers there. So you had the SS architects, then you had what they called civilian workers. These were architects and engineers who were not part of the SS, but they were under contract working there. And then the largest pool of workers were basically Polish, non-Jewish architects who had been put in the camp in 1940-41 and who basically were able to survive a little bit more comfortably in the camp, with a desk job instead of working out in really bad weather and being worked to death in these big earth moving exercises by working in the drawing room. And the same happened in Buchenwald. Also, inmates were very important in producing those drawings. Quite often, when you look at the drawing, you see it's signed by three people. The first one's quite often a number. That's the inmate number. That's actually the person who puts the lines on the paper. Then it's checked by a junior architect, and then it's signed off by the senior architect, Karl Bischoff.
Wow, I didn't realize
all according to the rules.
Yeah. There's a question here about, did anything from any architecture features from Auschwitz, was there anything unique that sort of entered the post-war world? Are there any Auschwitz architecture features we would see in modern architecture?
And not that it wasn't invented that way, but of course the gas chambers and crematoria are, I think, the canonical buildings of the 20th century. At least that's what I argued when I did my PhD defense. My PhD defense was on the tradition of the Temple of Jerusalem, and somebody asked, what is the equivalent for the future? What is going to have the same impact on our future that the temple, the memory of the temple had on both Judaism and Christianity for 2,000 years? And I said the crematory of Auschwitz. So yes, this is an incredible burden. And this is in some way, I think, has changed our whole understanding of basically the moral questions that relate to architecture, because nobody really has ever asked about the morality except in terms of style. Gothic, neo-Gothic being more moral than neoclassical or something like that. The enormous fight in the 19th century, or a white box, designed by Mies van der Rohe or Le Corbusier being more moral than a neo-Tudor house built in an American suburb. So that was typically the discussion on morality and architecture up to anyone started looking at these buildings.
And obviously, we know that you've spent much of your career sort of fighting the denialists out there who claim these gas chambers didn't exist, and you're able to prove through your research, how they did and how we can prove they did. Has that leveled off? Are we still seeing chatter on social media and in the world that these things didn't exist?
The architectural. So they're basically you can watch Errol Morris's movie Mr. Death about it. In some way, there were. I would say it was almost like the groups of people who met in clubs, had their own journals, all focusing on the architectural evidence as that what either proves or disproves that Auschwitz was a purposefully designed, that was adapted, but ultimately a factory of death. That very technical argument, that isn't that important anymore. Right now, Holocaust denial can do without it, because the difference between the year 2000 or 1990s, in the 1990s, in some way, the idea of evidence and a forensic kind of investigation of the evidence was still important even for the deniers. Right now, we are in a complete different world. We are in a complete fog in the world of the media today, where nobody has any, I certainly didn't deny, I didn't like the deniers. I despise them. I mean, I know some of them also. You meet them in my work. I mean, certainly I got to know Irving, who always was, by the way, very polite to me. And I tried to be polite to him. And there's no reason to start screaming at each other in a courtroom, especially not. But at least they worked hard to try to basically make their crazy arguments. They invested a lot of energy in studying this stuff. Nowadays, we're in a situation where anti-Semitism is on the rise, Holocaust denial is on the rise. But when basically people have attention spans, which is basically a few nanoseconds, which is the reality of our media-saturated environment, if basically we live in a Twitter culture, I mean, the kind of forensic analysis, either for good or evil, that these plans that require doesn't survive in a Twitter environment. So no, this is not important anymore, because in some way the poison is out and nobody asks these questions anymore about evidence, because evidence have become completely, utterly irrelevant in our age. And this is, it fills me with despair.
And on that, note of evidence, should we be preserving these architectural structures, or should we be letting them, sort of decay as
they have decayed? I mean, they're ruined. They're all ruins. Yeah, they're all ruins already. Yeah. Should we preserve the ruins? Yeah, it's very difficult, but yes, please, let's preserve them as
much as we can.
And that one of the things is then you don't want to have visitors to Auschwitz-Birkenau start walking on them. I mean, I've seen many Jewish groups, especially, in a kind of act of defiance, coming with Israeli flags, and then they will not going to be told by any Polish guard of the site because they associate it with the anti-Semitic Poles. Yeah, so we have here the groups coming in and they start dancing the horror on the roof of the gas chamber, thinking that this might be meaningful and might be meaningful to them. But I, as a historian and as a person who's interested in the preservation of these places, I'm horrified by this. I mean, I do not think there's any place for any political demonstration in Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's a place of private mourning, I would say. And I don't think that any national flag, German, Israeli, Canadian, American, has any place in there. Yeah, but then to actually start at the most fragile of these places, which are ruins, and ruins are very fragile because there's no roof covering them. Yeah, they're not protected by anything. And then to actually enter this as an act of defiance is complete madness, and complete madness of the people who are running these tours, that they allow it to do it. And I think the Auschwitz Museum was absolutely right to basically charge the people with whatever is available in the Polish law for trespassing. Mm-hmm. And I say this as a person who's concerned about the future of these places. And I think March of people who join the March of the Living, March of Remembrance and Hope, and so on, I think many of them behave well, but it's the few who basically destroy these places.
That's a good reminder.
Sorry to have to.
No, it's a good reminder for us all. Absolutely. So everybody, we have received over 30 questions, and I am so sorry we're not going to be able to go to all of them. I'm going to ask one last question right now. For those of you who do not get your questions answered this evening, please feel free to email us afterwards, and we will compile all the questions.
There's one thing which is really upsets me is people dancing on the roof of the gas chamber. The more things answering 32 emails. Today I got 120 emails from 7 a.m. until I started this lecture. So not too many emails. Try to combine them as
we'll try combining as many as we can. Absolutely. Yeah. And many we've gotten to as we've moved along. So final question. We have a lot of architects in training, aspiring architects on tonight's call, and certainly all of us live our lives in buildings, whether we're architects or not. What should we take away from this as far as the built environment and our relationship with it from an ethical lens?
Now, I think we have architecture in some way. We have talked about the statics a lot. I mean, we have 2,000 years of discussion amongst architects of what are the right aesthetics, what is the way, how do buildings represent our values? Yeah, I do think that what in some way the Auschwitz crematoria at the extreme, yeah, and the extreme, I'm confident those buildings are not going to be built anymore. This is not the future of the discipline. But between those buildings and the buildings we normally use, there are many buildings which I think we might start to look at again more critically because of those buildings. I love a statement by a very important book for me in my own formation as a person thinking about it, called The City Builder. It was published it was originally built, I think, published in the 70s, then in the early 80s. And it's about basically a city builder. And he basically says, we architects, we design apartments that are meant to teach us to hate each other. Yeah. And for me, in some way, that remark, if we start, if my students and your students and every student start actually to look at the designs that they are creating in terms of what it actually does to people's relationship to each other. I mean, one reason or another, it seems to be that most architecture studios that are most popular with both teachers and students is to design a house for a single collector of art. But that has nothing to do with the question of how we are going to survive together on this planet. So I would like to have a more complex question asked in studios. In Singapore, I lived, and that will be my last thing. In Singapore, I lived in government housing when I taught at the University of Singapore, and the university, the government did place in these buildings both Chinese Singaporeans and also Muslim Singaporeans next to next in apartments, which all seems to be very fine unless you realize that the Chinese food is based on pork. And the tensions that were created by this decision were actually used by the government to play these particular groups against each other. It was on purpose. These apartment buildings were designed to teach people to hate each other so that the government could be the arbiter. And I'm not that paranoid because I actually had a government architect tell me that when I was there.
Wow.
So,
well, I don't think any of us are going to look at architecture the same way again. And I want to thank you, Dr. Van Pelt, so much for being with us this evening. I know I'm leaving tonight thinking about a lot. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank you to our sponsors, the Shovers, and to our wonderful partners. And I hope you'll join us for future programs through the Holocaust Education Resource Center. And have a wonderful night, everybody. Thank you.
thank you.